It's my pleasure to introduce Derek Blackadder, who has over 40 years experience as a union activist. He is the Canadian coordinator for LabourStart and also writes for the web work column Our Times magazine and is a regular contributor to Radio Labour and other union media. In the 80s, he was a pioneer in unions' use of online communication and organizing tools. Derek is also a co-chair of the Northumberland County, Ontario Coalition for Social Justice and a volunteer board member with a number of labor-related non-government organizations, including the Canadian Labour International Film Festival. Derek is here with us today to share his perspectives on global labor issues and struggles, what we can learn about the future we face by looking at what is happening elsewhere. So, Derek, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Kelly. That was very kind. Wonderful introduction. Now let's see if my 1980s experience with unions and online communications can extend to me sharing a screen. Oops. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay, I made a huge mistake in volunteering to do this today. It's not because I'm not going to enjoy the company, and it's not because I don't always enjoy my time with CCU folks, but I bit off well more than I could chew. I thought that talking about the pandemic and its impact on trade unions and on labor rights around the world would be a pretty simple matter. There'd certainly be lots of information out there that I could pull together for you. And as it turns out, there's way too much information, something that I should have known from the get-go. So what I've done is I have chosen to break things down as simply as I possibly could. There's just a quick agenda or outline for my talk. But really, to do this topic justice would probably take a lifetime. In fact, I would expect that there are a bunch of labor studies professors out there who are preparing to devote the remainder of their life to the topic. So what I've done is pick out some themes and episodes and issues that I don't think are getting a great deal of attention in the media. And so they may be things that you haven't really had a chance to think about lately. But they are also issues and processes and crises and challenges that I think have the potential to be with us in the long term. So here's my overview. Here's my take on the pandemic. There is one. It's big. It's bad. And if you doubt that or you need any more details, just pick up a newspaper, look out the window, or turn on a radio. But in terms of attacks on labor rights, one of the, I think, big scandals of the media coverage of labor issues relating to the pandemic is the huge increase we're seeing in the use of child labor around the world and the lack of attention that it's getting. So defining a child laborer or a child worker is my preferred term, actually, even though child labor is in common usage. Defining a child worker basically means that the vast majority of who we're talking about when we talk about child laborers or child workers are people under the age of 12. The ILO's report on the 4-year period ending about the time that the pandemic first hit estimated that there were 160 million children who were employed. That would be about 1 out of every 10 children. 79 million of those, in other words, just a little under half, were employed in hazardous work. Now, I want you to remember that when we skip to the next bullet point. So while the percentage of children in child labor has remained roughly stable, the absolute numbers, because of population increases, the absolute number of people employed as child workers has increased over that 4-year period by 8 million. And the absolute number of children employed in hazardous work rose by 6.5 million, which is to say that the number of children employed in hazardous work is increasing much more quickly than the number of children employed generally. And that, I think, is frightening. And once again, this is not something that I have seen much attention given to over the last year or so. Now, remember, this is prior to the eruption of the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, there have been some very small studies done by academics employed by or connected with non-governmental organizations. By far the best one that I was able to find is from Human Rights Watch. It's best in terms of its analysis and also, frankly, of the gut punch that it will give you if you read it. But the downside to it is that it focuses on 3 countries. It's not a global study. So it focused on child labor changes as a result of the pandemic in Uganda, Ghana, and Nepal. I'll warn you, I highly recommend the report, but I warn you that the description of working conditions for the children that they studied, particularly the ones who were employed in hazardous jobs, is pretty gut-wrenching and can be quite upsetting. So a word of warning to anyone who's inclined to look it up. If you take the figures in the Human Rights Watch report and you extrapolate the increase in the population of children employed in those 3 countries to the globe, then, and this is just me, but I think you're looking at, in just the last year, an increase of about 10 to 15% in the absolute number of children employed. And there are some analyses which to be frank with you, I don't actually understand the statistics behind them, but there are some that project that the real increase is actually much higher, closer to 25 to 30%. The scariest thing about the Human Rights Watch extrapolations is that they suggest that child labor is making a comeback in countries where it was in decline, and even in countries where it was very close to being eradicated. And the big question, of course, is why? How could a virus, how could even a lethal virus like COVID-19 generate this kind of an increase in the use of children as workers? And the answers come from a number of different sources, but they seem to be broadly put, that child labor market participation, in other words, the percentage of children who wind up working rather than going to school or going to the playground or playing hooky or doing some of the other things that I did when I was a child, is inversely proportional to family income. So the closer your family's income is, if it's above the subsistence level, the closer your family income gets to the subsistence level, the more likely it is that you're going to be needed to generate income for your family. And if your family's income is below the subsistence level, then the probability rises even more steeply. Family incomes in countries in much of the global south have been rising generally until the pandemic hit. The pandemic changed that. As well, in addition, I'll back up a second. So the pandemic hits, my parents lose their jobs. There are no opportunities out there for them. Everybody in the family has to do whatever is necessary in order for the family to survive. And so I may wind up working. In fact, I may be considered lucky, or my family may be considered lucky because I am working. Now, as the pandemic starts to ease, which it is doing in the global north, not so much in the global south, but we are seeing some indications in some countries that that's occurring. But the predictions are that pretty well universally, as the pandemic eases, the public health restrictions disappear, and employment recovers, a lot of the employers in or some of the employers in much of the global south will continue to prefer to employ children, at least for an extended period after the recovery. And that's because they're cheaper, they're more docile, and for the most part, they are beyond the reach of trade unions. In many countries, for example, most of South Asia that I've looked at anyway, I'm not certain about Nepal, but in much of South Asia, you can legally work as a child, subject to some restrictions. There's basically there's no minimum age limit for employment, but there is actually an age limit for you to join a union, because the argument there being from the government and from employers is that, to join a union, you have to sign up as a member. You have to be old enough to be able to sign a contract or take on the legal responsibility of a contract, which oddly enough doesn't apply to the employment contract. My second candidate for scandalous omission by the traditional media, by the mainstream media during the pandemic in regard to labor rights issues, is the increase in the number of people who are living in slavery as a result of the pandemic. Now, I'm using the term which is generally used these days, which is modern slavery, and I've put inverted commas around modern on a couple of occasions. If you read a definition of modern slavery, you'll see that it's distinguished from regular old chattel slavery by the fact that people aren't born into it. Okay, I'm not sure that that's sufficient difference to call it something that, or to suggest by using the term modern slavery that it's somehow different. And the word modern, to my mind anyway, tends to suggest that it's somehow better than traditional slavery. And that's definitely not the case. Since the pandemic started, or rather since the public health restrictions associated with the pandemic were instituted around the world, we're seeing drastic increases in the number of people, both proven and estimated to be living in slavery. So sex work in Western Europe and North America, a noticeable and well-documented increase in the number of people who are being trafficked for those purposes, that purpose. Seafood harvesting and processing across the Pacific region. There, so-called modern slavery looks a whole lot more like the African slavery that we read about in the history books, where people are kidnapped, or people are told that they owe money, and if they would just show up in a particular place and at a particular time, they'll be offered employment which will allow them to pay back their debt. And they wind up on a ship harvesting shrimp across the Pacific. If you've ever eaten shrimp from a company unfortunately called Thai Union Seafood, the chances are pretty good that you're eating shrimp that was harvested by or processed by somebody who's living in slavery. In South Asia, the construction industry is rife with modern or the new variety of slavery. There are a significant proportion of the even skilled workforces on construction sites in much of South Asia consist of people who are essentially living in debt bondage, unable to change jobs, going from place to place, subsistence living, because at some point they went into debt to somebody that we would think of as a loan shark. In West Africa, agriculture is a hotspot for the modern slavery. And back in Western Europe, but also in Latin America, and I'm not sure why it's restricted to these two areas. Perhaps only it's because it's come to public notice there, but illegal drug production, including marijuana, in Mexico and South, as well as in large parts of Western Europe, is a problem area. The reliable evidence is, and this is empirical evidence, this isn't projections rather. The reliable evidence is that about 40.3 million people are currently living in slavery. In some analyses, the most reliable, I think, estimate comes from an organization called Slavery International, which now has been around for, I think, just over 200 years, working to eliminate slavery. And their number puts it at somewhere between 95 and 100 million people. All of which, all these numbers have increased significantly since the pandemic hit. The increase in the numbers of people living in slavery is concentrated in those areas that are hard hit by the pandemic, or where rather employment has been hard hit by the pandemic, but also where there's little or no social protections. So even at the best of times, these are countries where there's nothing resembling social assistance, nothing resembling employment insurance, nothing resembling workers' compensation. So there are no places to go if you're not able to earn a living other than doing something illegal. Incentives for employers are that legal operations, above board operations, have become more expensive as a result of the public health restrictions that have been imposed. So going underground is attractive. And once you go underground, why not go all the way? And so in countries like Bangladesh, we are seeing garment factories being told that the machine operators need to be spaced 2 meters apart. They need to be provided with, or they need to provide themselves with personal protective equipment. That eats into profits rather substantially. And so those factories are abandoned, or the buildings anyway are abandoned. The machinery is moved elsewhere, often into people's homes, but also often into underground factories in the countryside. And then the employer will go to, or the factory owner will go to, a labor broker is usually the term, but the labor brokers are very often just slavery dealers. They're people who have bought the debts of a large number of people. They actually select them for the skills that they have, and then they pass those people on to the factory owner. These are experienced machine operators who have been unemployed for 3 or 4 months, have gone into debt, and find themselves living in slavery as a result. Children are especially vulnerable in these circumstances, particularly in countries where schools closed without any alternative. And again, going back to the earlier section or discussion of child labor, the children are often the breadwinners for an entire family. And in circumstances like these, they become the way in which a family at least perceives or hopes, rather desperately probably, to be able to get out of debt and to be able to get back to something resembling the pre-pandemic normal. Growth in the number of people living in slavery. All of the NGOs and including the International Labor Organization, who look at the issue, are convinced that it will continue to grow after the pandemic ends because of the reverberations, the ongoing impact of the pandemic on employment and earnings in these parts of the world. Domestic workers, excuse me. Domestic workers. Again, not something I think that we've seen a lot of news about. The ILO this week, and this was my excuse for putting this PowerPoint deck together yesterday rather than weeks ago, but the ILO released a report earlier this week on the 10th anniversary of ILO Convention 189, which is the ILO Convention regarding the rights of domestic workers. Now, the convention is 10 years old, or was 10 years old. I think it was on Tuesday. It had some interesting things to say about the situation, generally speaking, of domestic workers around the world. And remember, for the most part, the ILO report dealt with the entire past decade. It didn't focus on the pandemic. So 36% worldwide, the ILO says that 36% of domestic workers have no legal existence. So these are not people who are eligible for, the Chinese equivalent of CERB. They're not eligible for programs like social assistance or employment insurance, even where those things exist. The International Domestic Workers Federation is the global union federation for this sector. Some of you, I think, may belong to unions that are affiliated with one or possibly even more of the global union federations. But as far as I know, no CCU affiliate represents domestic workers. So you may not be familiar with the IDWF. It has 81 affiliates, which is 81 unions in 63 countries, representing almost 600,000 domestic and household workers around the world. It's been leading the charge in regard to domestic workers who often escape the notice, not just of the media, but also of the governments in their home and in their host countries. A large majority of domestic workers are women. In many countries, including Canada, most domestic workers are migrants. Many are also live-in workers, and this is important. There are people like nannies, cooks, etc., babysitters. Sorry about the typo. But that means that their residence is also their workplace, and that's key to one of the serious challenges that these folks face. Pre-pandemic, according to both the IDWF and the ILO report, sexual harassment, violence, physical abuse, wage theft, and substandard accommodation were common. The impact of the pandemic includes mass unemployment. And the worst example I could find of this was Hong Kong, where a public health regulation almost overnight resulted in 400,000 people losing their jobs. 98.6% of them were women. The Hong Kong government may be nasty when it comes to the things that it does to domestic workers, but it's pretty fastidious about keeping records of how nasty it's being and who it's being nasty to. So 98.6 of them were women, most of them from the Philippines. For almost all of these people, what came with the loss of their employment was homelessness. Most of their contracts provided for weekly or monthly payments, but the standard contract provided for a lump sum payment upon completion of the contract and also a return ticket to the Philippines. The numbers are unclear, but the International Domestic Workers Federation's conclusion is that a large majority of the workers who were rendered unemployed did not receive either of those things. Wage theft is a pretty common problem, but we're talking in this instance about 400,000 people who lost their jobs within about 24 hours. It was a huge amount of money, and it overstressed all of the agencies that an individual woman who had lost her job and couldn't return to the Philippines could rely on or go to for assistance. They just simply couldn't cope with that volume of demand for their services or for their assistance. And of course, back in the Philippines, as those 400,000 or nearly 400,000 women lost their jobs, back in the Philippines were whole families who were dependent for remittances from those domestic workers for their household budgets. The International Domestic Workers Federation developed a repatriation program. It's a drop in the bucket, frankly, but they're doing all they can. And this is not a, shall we say, an overly well-funded or well-endowed organization. Their website does allow for donations, either from individuals or from trade unions. If you Google IDWF, I keep wanting to say IWD for obvious reasons. You can find them, and if you're looking for a place to park some money, and we'll get to a point a little later in my presentation about why you might have some extra money in need of a place to be parked. This might be a good place to send it. They've also been pressing governments, both the home governments of these workers and host governments, for assistance. And individual affiliates, the IDWF itself has not been doing this, but many of its affiliates have been trying to develop family assistance programs, trying to keep the dependence of the domestic workers afloat until things stabilize. They've also been providing support, mostly political and technical assistance for their affiliates organizing and mobilizing. And Canada and Kenya are pretty good examples of that. And you can read more about that on the IDWF website. Their goal is to ease the worst effects of the pandemic and build stronger unions in the process. And I think that second point is key, right? They're not simply being reactive, they're looking down the road and trying to be proactive. Migrant workers more generally, because there are lots of them who are not, in fact, a large majority are probably not, a very large majority are not domestic workers, have also been tremendously affected by the pandemic. Migrant workers in Canada alone had a positive test rate 8 times that of the general population, and that's nationally. There are clusters where it is that skew the statistics. So, for example, I wasn't able to find any data for Newfoundland and Labrador, but there are hotspots in Alberta and in Ontario and in British Columbia where the difference between their rate of infection and the general population's rate of infection is rather spectacular. Of course, we're not the only country that hosts migrant workers in large numbers. Regions like the Arabian Gulf have living and working conditions that were pretty much perfect, designed to encourage the spread of COVID-19. And in those countries, or even in Canada, really, other than domestic work, sectors that employ like agriculture, construction, those workplaces were not shut down. They may have been isolated, as they were with many of the farms near where I live, when there was an outbreak. They might have been isolated and sealed off from the rest of the world, but they weren't shut down, and there was no quick improvement to the living and working conditions that would have prevented the ongoing spread of the disease. When those workplaces shut down, the workers generally, again, this was also a problem in Canada because of the well, it was a problem in Canada for a bunch of reasons, but again, the areas of the world, the regions of the world that employ large numbers of migrant workers, like the Gulf, aren't overburdened with social protection programs. And so these workers may have been fed, but that was pretty much it. And again, their dependents in their home country suffered as a result. And in most cases, in most cases, the dependents outnumber the actual workers significantly. Healthcare access is a huge problem for migrant workers. Border restrictions mean that stays are being extended or workers are unable to start contracts on which they are dependent for an income. So even those people who didn't catch the disease and who weren't actually at work in a country other than their home country, they still suffered as a result. Unions, generally speaking, have limited access to or interest in organizing migrant workers. UFCW Canada is one of the relatively rare exceptions to that rule. And so in much of the world, and even in large parts of Canada, NGOs, non-governmental organizations and not unions are carrying the load. And that's a bad thing, I think, in a couple of ways. First off, of course, these workers aren't being organized for the purpose of an ongoing ability to deal with their living and working conditions. But also those NGOs are normally dependent on their charitable status to generate the funds that they use for programs like this. And these programs, if they're going to be effective, need to be really, really well funded. And there just isn't the money in the NGO bank account to cover it. We, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of television time, a lot of screen time, and the odd front page devoted to what was happening on cruise ships. And it, I don't think escaped anybody's or too many people's notice that the reason why cruise ships got all of that attention was because the passengers were folks like you and I, right? But the crews on those ships and the crews on the other ships, the ones that are bringing all those shipping containers full of plastic toys to our local dollar stores, they didn't get very much attention at all. So I thought it'd be worth highlighting some of the struggles that they faced over the last year and a half. These are people who are important to us. You know, these are the people who bring us the ventilators that our ICUs use. At any one time, there are about 1.75 million seafarers out there on the ocean somewhere. And that total doesn't include domestic shipping. So that wouldn't include, for example, most of the members of the Seafarers International Union of Canada who, you know, travel from Sept-Îles to Thunder Bay on the Great Lakes. The restrictions associated with COVID-19 meant that while goods could continue to move and could be offloaded at their destinations, the crews could not be. Now, and so for extended periods of time, the crews were forced to remain on their ships. The accommodations on these ships are better than the ones that my father lived with in the last few years of World War II, but they're not the kind of places where you would like to spend 13 or 14 months. Even now, there's an estimate out there from the International Transport Workers Federation that 75,000 crew members have been aboard their ships since the start of the pandemic. And we're getting pretty close to the 1.5 year mark, depending on, you know, the country where they were expected to get off and could rotate. The crew of a ship, it could be, I think, what, about 15 months now? 16 months? The International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF, is the only global union federation with collective agreements. So it actually, unlike all the other global union federations, it actually negotiates with large international shipping companies. So it was able to negotiate directly with employers. So when I say negotiate, I don't mean, they sat down in a room, or they sat down at a computer screen with a nice cup of coffee and were wearing a suit and thrashed out a reasonable deal because everybody at the table was, concerned about the welfare of ship's crews. What that meant was that they were able to negotiate directly because the crews are actually members of the ITF and not of another union that is in turn affiliated with the ITF. And so those crews were mobilized to put pressure on owners. So you saw a series of import strikes and slowdowns that brought pressure on the employers who then agreed to join with the ITF and negotiate agreements with governments to get those crews off the ships. Those agreements only started taking effect because the employers were resistant, of course. From their perspective, I suppose there's really no advantage or disadvantage to the pandemic situation. They're paying the same, whether it's a fresh crew or a stale crew. And there may even be savings there because I think in some collective agreements that the ITF has, the cost of travel to and from the port where they get on their ship is, or from that port where they get off their ship to their home, is paid for by the employer. And so without those expenses, there might have been a few more bucks in the shareholders' pockets. So it took a while, but once those agreements were negotiated, governments didn't seem to be too reluctant to agree to proposals so long as isolation was guaranteed. But a bigger problem, a more lasting problem, is that of the crews or crew members who weren't able to join their ships. And so they have been now, if I'm a crew member who's been stuck on a ship for 15 months, that means that there's a counterpart to me who has been at home for 15 months and not earning. And so the ITF is still trying to do what it can to assist those of its members who've been at home or in port for the last year or more. I really did. I attempted to put together something to talk about the impact of the pandemic on women workers. And I was overwhelmed. In the end, I've decided that this one slide that you're looking at, this is what I have to say specifically about women. Once you get started, it never seems to stop. And it's a cascading series of disasters for working women. And it's irregardless of geographic location, wherever you look, the impact on workers hit women workers far harder than it hit male workers. Platform workers or gig workers. Until recently, and I think this is still the case in much of Canada, though there is a postal workers decision from the Ontario Labour Relations Board that hopefully is the wedge in the door. But until recently, by platform workers, I mean Amazon, Uber, Deliveroo, the rest of them, have been treated as independent contractors. In other words, the employer says, you provide the car, you provide your clothes and all of that good stuff, and we'll give you a bunch of things to deliver, or we'll give you some people who want to ride somewhere. And that's the extent of our involvement. You work when you want to. We have no control over the quality of the service you provide and all that stuff. So you're treated as an independent contractor. In countries like Australia and the US and Brazil, workers were actually wound up at the start of the pandemic, being penalized for health and safety violations as though they were their own employer, which added tremendously to the stress as well as the cost of their employment. Not long prior to the pandemic, I would say about 3 years, perhaps 4, we'd started to see around the world organizing efforts. In some cases, you see unions like the one I reference here, the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, which was a union basically formed of and by and for platform workers. In other instances, like in Ontario, where UFCW has been organizing Uber drivers, and the postal workers have been organizing Deliveroo food service delivery workers. They were being organized into a traditional existing union. As the pandemic hit, these efforts intensified. Platform workers were universally reporting high levels of stress. There were higher than normal. The only place I could find that had reasonable statistics or reasonably reliable statistics, or what looked like reasonably reliable statistics, was Australia. And there it was clear that they were at much higher risk of infection than other workers, simply because I suppose they were interacting with a large number of people throughout their workday. Uber and other platform employers responded instantly, and I mean instantly, with well-funded efforts to ensure that government regulations did not affect their employees' non-status as employees. You may remember, some of you may remember anyway, last year there was a referendum in California, and one of the items on the referendum agenda was something called Proposition 22, which asked the Californian citizens to vote on whether platform workers should be considered to be employees or they should be considered to be independent contractors. Because of course, you know, that's the kind of decision you want to have made by people who wouldn't know a platform worker from a hole in the ground. The result of that was, after the platform companies like Uber spent $224 million US. Now that's not a typo. There are some typos in here, but that's not one of them. They spent $224 million in order to ensure that their workers are not considered employees. They were successful, of course. You know, if I spent $224 million to make the sun shine every day, I'd probably be successful in that. So there was no surprise. Since then, though, there are new organizing efforts springing up almost weekly, including in Canada. Now, Uber's response to the continuing efforts to organize is to try and take its victory in California and apply it elsewhere. Pretty much everywhere where it operates, including Europe, Latin America, and Canada. What it has done is develop what it considers to be ideal legislation or regulations for gig workers in a specific jurisdiction. And then it goes to the politicians in that jurisdiction and lobbies hard to get the changes it wants. So for example, I live in Ontario. Uber has been approaching the Ontario government and pushing hard to have amendments to the Ontario Labour Relations Act to make it clear that its employees are not employees. Other platform employers are doing the same thing, and it's worth noting once again that what happened in California was that all the platform companies, even the ones that compete with each other, got together and pooled their resources and their energy to push Proposition 22. And at the moment, at least, because of the pandemic, most of these platform employers are seeing huge increases in their profits. Amazon is probably the most obvious example, but all of them appear to be experiencing a surplus of loose cash. And so these efforts are really well funded. There's something that strikes, I guess, at the heart of well, I was going to say the mechanical heart of trade unions, but in many ways, it's also the political heart as well, and that's our collective agreement. Our collective agreements, rather, and the overrides and suspensions we've seen. Now, I've thrown in a few Canadian examples here, just because I still do a little bit of work with Canadian unions, and I live here. And I hope this isn't an inappropriate way of putting it, but on a almost personal level, these things really piss me off. So we're seeing collective agreement overrides and suspensions where overnight, as has happened in some Canadian jurisdictions, in Ontario, for example, where I live, collective agreements have been overridden. So in Quebec, think about this, if ever you, hopefully you won't, but if ever you find yourself in an emergency room in Quebec, the nurses, the people treating you, the nurses, the staff doctors, the security guards, the hospital cleaners who are keeping you safe from infection, from, picked up on the doorknobs. Those folks haven't had a vacation in over a year. They've been subjected to mandatory overtime, and all the scheduling and vacation, mandatory overtime provisions of their collective agreement are not currently in operation. And that's in Canada. And then in countries like Indonesia, Uganda, and Paraguay, the suspensions have been much broader. They go well beyond healthcare. They cover whole sectors of the economy, or even every collective agreement in a country, which I think is the case, as I recall, in Paraguay. And they're clearly the result of employer influence on government policy. And what's also clear is that employers are taking advantage of this situation to, as the expression goes, make hay while the sun shines. So, for example, even if you just restrict yourself to healthcare, which where I suppose, the average member of the public might think, well, nurses maybe, shouldn't be able to take 6 weeks vacation during a pandemic. In Paraguay, in the healthcare sector, what happened was that the collective agreements were all suspended for the duration of the emergency. And the employers, and we're talking about a private healthcare system here, well, calling it a system may be a little too robust, but in any case, hospitals are private for-profit facilities for the most part, some charity exceptions. What they immediately began doing was laying off healthcare workers. And the result was, as expected and as planned, I suppose, was an increase in profits. And of course, overworked and overstressed employees left behind by those who had been laid off. The other thing that occurred in Indonesia, Uganda, and Paraguay, and probably elsewhere, is that when the collective agreements were suspended, supposedly for the purpose of ensuring that there were sufficient staff in place to keep healthcare facilities going, union activists were sacked, and they didn't have access to the protections of their collective agreement. So it allowed employers to clean house. Telework is also, I think, worth talking about. This actually is the subject of a fair bit of discussion. What I haven't seen so far, though, is a great deal of discussion within trade unions. I'm hoping that it's because I'm retired now and I don't have the same insider perspective. But like Zoom, it's not a new thing. but it certainly came into its own as soon as the pandemic hit. The pros of telework are, of course, that it minimizes exposure to the virus. It's very popular with some workers, though I question just how excited we should get about how popular it is. So, for example, women workers often find it attractive because it allows them to do both of their jobs, their childcare jobs or their home care jobs while doing their paying job. And so while it may be a good thing in the short term, in the long term, it simply defers, pushes off the problem. It reduces employer costs for sure. It allows workers to deal with closed schools, daycare centers, that kind of thing. And it also allows for the maintenance of employment, which might otherwise be problematic or high risk in a health sense. On the other hand, for the most part, only privileged workers are eligible. So, for example, the people who in Canada we refer to as pandemic heroes or essential workers, few, if any of them, work in jobs that would allow them to work at home. You're not going to sell me a box of laundry detergent at my local Metro grocery store by working at home. And so those folks still have to come into work. Rather bizarrely, call center employers have continued to insist that their employees come to work rather than work at home, even though you would think that technically, at least, that it'd be extremely easy for them to work at home. Workers are assuming some role of the costs associated with shifting the work into their homes. So the cost of internet connections, additional phone lines or cell phones, that sort of thing, those costs are being offloaded onto workers. And it divides workers and it separates workers from their union. And it's perhaps a bit airy-fairy or a bit romantic, but unions were built on large workplaces, industrial workplaces, where workers shared an experience of work. And when less of that experience is shared, are we still going to see unions as we know them? And I think that's an interesting question, and I hope I live long enough to see the answer. Okay, there are some resources out there. This is Industrial's Principles and Guidelines on Telework. They're one of several global union federations that is attempting to provide some guidance to its affiliates on the question of telework, how to do it, and what pitfalls to look for. I'm going to try and speed things up just a little bit. So I'm going to look at, I also thought it would be worthwhile looking at a couple of countries. So as you can see, Colombia. If I could see all of you, I would ask you all to raise your hand if you knew anything or had heard anything about the general strike in Colombia. As you can see, one of the reasons I picked this picture is that I think it's really interesting that the strikers are wearing masks, and one of them is also wearing a ventilator, but the police are not. So I don't know why, but that strikes me as interesting, and I'm sure there's some deep meaning in that. But what's I think more important is the violence with which the picket line is being met. So earlier this year, it said anyway, to fund programs to reduce the impact of the pandemic on businesses. And the government was quite explicit about this, businesses. They are very definitely of the trickle-down economics school of thought on this question. The government announced huge tax increases on low and middle income earners. In addition to that, on the expenditure side, social programs were cut. So this could have been designed by Thatcher or Reagan. The result was a national general strike that's been running for about a month and a half, I think, and the daily protests. So far, the police admit to killing 63 strikers. 2,300 have been wounded seriously enough and comfortable enough with being identified as a striker to have been hospitalized. And hundreds of people have simply disappeared or been disappeared either by the police or by right-wing paramilitary groups that have experienced the resurgence since the pandemic hit. They had gone into a bit of a decline after the end of the Civil War. Some of you will remember that it wasn't, I was going to say there was a joke. It wasn't a joke. There was a wry prediction, perhaps, that if you were the president of the Coca-Cola Workers Union in Colombia, you were very lucky to live for more than, I think it was 3 or 4 years. And until very recently, no president of that union survived assassination attempts for more than about 4 or 5 years. Then the Civil War ended. It started to get better. Now it's getting worse. If you want to help out, of course, LabourStart is there. And we're running an online action campaign on behalf of it's been sponsored by the Public Services International, but it's really on behalf of all of PSI's Colombian affiliates. Brazil. Healthcare workers. In Brazil, I'll assume that you've all heard something of their president, the current president, Bolsonaro. Since his election, trade unions have been major voices in opposition to the national government's policy of ignoring the pandemic. And of course, that's true of trade unions generally. The labor movement in Brazil, with the exception of one federation, are all supporters of the, in English, it would be the Brazilian Workers' Party, I think is how it translates. That was led for a number of years by a man named trade union leader named Lula. So generally speaking, unions have been targeted, were targeted right from his election for a variety of forms of repression. But in particular, since the pandemic hit, healthcare unions have been under the spotlight or under the gun, literally under the gun. And public criticism of the government's policies by healthcare unions usually results in a wave of terminations. People also report being harassed by the police, everything from parking tickets to home searches, that sort of thing. And again, if the mood takes you and you check out the LabourStart website, you can join an online action that we're running. Again, it's Public Services International on behalf of its Brazilian healthcare affiliates. So we've got, I'm doing okay. We should get in on time with this. So some of the lessons from this for Canadian unions, some of the lessons we've already learned, right? Here's a news story from Montreal about the decision to extend what was at the time almost a year-long ban on vacations for Quebec healthcare workers. And you can look up the story if you'd like, and there are a number of others, but the stories people tell are frightening. Nurses, hospital cleaners, emergency room doctors who have been going 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3-4 months. They get a couple of days off, and then they get a phone call and they're back in. I'm amazed that they're able to hold up under that kind of stress. Other lessons learned. None of these, as my heading says, none of these are anything but no-brainers. So when you look around the world at the labor movements that have done well and not done well, militant, deeply organized unions reacted faster and were more effective. My favorite of all the examples that I can give is the Spanish labor movement. They are actually, and have been, I think it would be fair to say, for about 6 months now, they've actually been on the offensive. They set down, as did the unions on my second bullet point, they set down internally and also with some of what they call their social partners. So women's organizations and organizations organizations representing unemployed workers, they sat down and came up with an agenda of their own. And so in Spain, if you're a retail worker, the past year has certainly not been pleasant. And if you're a hospitality worker, it's been very unpleasant. But the chances are pretty good from the situation as it's developing now, that your terms and conditions of employment, your situation generally is going to be much improved as a result of the pandemic. Excuse me. Another favorite example of mine is South Africa, where both COSATU and SAFTU, and what's remarkable about them working together so closely on this is that SAFTU is a split from COSATU. I think the split's only about 5 or 6 years old. Also, the PIT-CNT in Uruguay, the ASI and all of its affiliates in Iceland. I love Icelandic unions. If ever you go to Iceland, which I would highly recommend, do not go without arranging to have lunch with somebody from ASI or any one of its affiliates before you go. They do amazing things, and nobody knows about it because there are only 300,000 people on this little island stuck in the middle of the North Atlantic. But also Norway and Tunisia. There, again, the central labor bodies held conferences to evaluate the pandemic. They paid researchers to try and figure out what the impact would look like. And then they had conferences afterwards to try and figure out how to turn things around so that their goal was not to simply get back to normal, but was to get back to something abnormal but good for workers. And I think with this audience, I can say this. I see absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the Canadian Labour Congress hasn't been engaged in any of this. And I'm not expecting a reaction, but it's the largest central labor body in this country, and one with significant resources. And so far as I'm aware, nothing like this is happening here. Bread and butter unions, unions that prided themselves, whether they were militant or not, on focusing on workplace issues as opposed to political action or wider social engagement. They, generally speaking, in my survey anyway, have not done well. Unions with a history of direct political action rather than simply getting their members out to vote or undertaking lobbying efforts did a much better job of ensuring social protections for workers. I don't know if you saw it, but there was a ranking produced by, and I looked at it this morning and I cannot remember the name of the agency that produced it. But if you go to the Uni Global Union, UNI, all capitals, you go to their website, they have a copy of the report available. And Argentina ranked #1 in the world for providing social protections for workers affected by the pandemic. That means payments like CERB, that sort of thing. And it's impossible not to credit the CTA and the CTAA and their long history of national political strikes for what happened there. They can go to their government and say, we will shut this country down if you don't do this. And the government will take it seriously. They will know that it's been done before, it's been done regularly. And when it happens, it works. And that the CTA and the CTAA have the backing of their members. Few unions saw the pandemic as an opportunity the way the Spanish movement did. Most trade unions have been unable to get past the defensive stage of their reaction. And my sense of the news anyway, as I see it, and this is news off of union websites, not from the mainstream media, is that the focus remains on returning to normal, not on doing anything new, not on trying to build something new, but simply get back to the, and I think this describes it nicely, actually, the good old days. Reductions in operational travel and meeting expenses have generated huge savings for some large dispersed unions. And if the union's membership has not been much affected by the pandemic, those savings have freed up money for other purposes. I know in Canada, at least, I'm not aware of anything happening outside the country. I'm told that it is, but it's mostly, I think, rumor. But a few unions in Canada are looking seriously at what they can continue to do online rather than in person, freeing up cash for other purposes permanently. So redirecting, ideally, in my mind anyway, redirecting money from, flying people around the country to go to meetings that last for 2 hours, and instead directing that cash into organizing programs. Internet, look, you ask somebody from LabourStart to do a presentation for you, you got to put up with some tech talk. So here it is. So, now's the time to turn off your camera and go for a walk, or to get a cup of coffee, or go to the washroom. But internet-based video conferencing alone has made a striking appearance on the scene for trade unions in the past year. It's reduced the cost to unions for events like arbitrations. I do arbitration work for some CUPE locals in places like Timmins, Kapuskasing, Iroquois Falls. For them, the cost of an arbitration is probably 3, maybe 4 times as much as it would be for a local union in Toronto, simply because of the travel and accommodation costs. If you want to get an arbitrator into Iroquois Falls, you're looking at paying that arbitrator for a 1-day hearing. You're probably going to pay that arbitrator for 2 days, because they have to fly in the day before, and they may not be able to fly out the day late in the day of. They have to stay for an additional day before they can get home. Plus, there's the transportation and accommodation costs. So those were locals that had, and they tend to be small locals in isolated locations like that, without a great deal of money. And so they had to make difficult choices very often about what they could afford to litigate and what they couldn't. I also, and this is universal, I am hearing from all of my friends back in the union bureaucracy world about increased rates of participation in trade union activities by women, especially, and by workers in isolated locations. When you don't have to, if you're, a mother, a parent, when you don't have to find a babysitter to go to an evening meeting, it makes life a lot easier, and it makes participation in your union a lot easier if you can just turn on your computer or your phone and go to a union meeting. And so we're seeing, and this may fade, but for the first year or so of the pandemic, we were seeing large increases in the number of people who are participating. And, frankly, I'll be, my opinion, because I have heard a couple of people say that they're expecting the numbers to drop. If that happens in your union, then I think you need to think about what you're doing at union meetings when people show up once or twice, and it's as easy as turning on their computer or starting an app on their phone, and they go to a meeting or two and they decide they're never going to go again. Maybe you should be rethinking the content of your meetings or the way you conduct them. The more inflexible union education, you guys were flagging Jane McAlevy's Organizing for Power course. That thing has, last time I looked in, it had 7,000 people participating from 140 countries. And there may be lots of other events like that happening that was not imaginable prior to the pandemic. And also, events like the one like this are made much easier and are made much more accessible by the use of technology like this, rather than insisting that people show up at a meeting in Ottawa or in Vancouver physically in order to be able to be bored stiff by my droning monotone for 45 minutes. Workplace level organizing and coordination has hugely expanded. So, for example, I know of a couple of woodwork unions, logging unions, I guess, local unions in Canada, who now are using Zoom to have meetings with their comrades who work for the same company in places like Indonesia, the United States, and even in Russia. And that, again, was unimaginable. And if that kind of contact occurred in the past, it occurred through the mechanisms of the Global Union Federation, which slowed things down, and oftentimes things got lost in the shuffle. So this now is direct. If you can find them, you can talk to them. You can even arrange for a translation if you don't speak a shared language. Australia's United Workers Union is getting around public health restrictions in its anti-wage theft campaign with an app that it developed called Mobilize. And since the pandemic started, UWU in Australia has launched 4 new specialized apps. And these are meant to provide some guidance or assistance or depending on our services to members without the need for physical contact. Though there is the possibility of either video conferencing or voice calls when necessary. In the United Kingdom, Unions 21 and the Trades Unions Congress Digital Lab have been doing amazing work, really amazing work, in evaluating what unions have been doing as a result or in response to the pandemic. And they've been sharing the results. And really, it's not technical. It just gives you an idea of what's possible. But if you're at all interested, Google the TUC Digital Lab and spend some quality time just reading over the work that they do. It's really, really quite amazing. And I was thinking about a friend of mine who runs walking history tours in Barcelona a while ago, and he's had to move online, of course, since the tourism industry in Spain shut down. And he does Zoom walking history tours of Barcelona, mostly focused on the Spanish Civil War. He does a great one. It's a 2-parter on Spanish unions during the Spanish Civil War, if you're interested. Email me and I'll connect you to him. That's the end of the commercial. But using similar technology, Unite, they started it, but other unions have adopted it, are doing things like having specialist staff, getting them access to workplaces that they normally wouldn't get access to, and all because of the pandemic. So in the case of Unite, for example, if you were in a workplace and you were a local activist, a member, a rank and file member who had an interest in health and safety, you were the equivalent of a joint committee member, and you were up against something you didn't understand and you needed some technical advice. Of course, you might have difficulty getting your employer to get you into the workplace, but also because of the public health restrictions, that just, you wouldn't even bother trying to work on your employer to make that happen because it just couldn't. What instead has happened is, thanks to the smartphone that you probably have in your back pocket, you're able to take that health and safety specialist or that ergonomist or that industrial hygienist on a tour of your workplace and give them a close-up look at the problem they're facing and get advice from them. And I think that's pretty amazing. It's probably a bit of a nightmare for the staff person involved because, they don't get the break that comes with a 2-hour drive to a workplace where you can think about things and plan your day and all of that stuff. But for the workers, this is access to a level of expertise that they probably have never seen before. Workers, I think, are desperate. It's I think, fading, but generally over the past year, workers have been desperate for COVID-19 news and information from their union. And there are a whole bunch of offerings out there in terms of podcasts, both video and audio podcasts. And I mentioned podcasts because they're the kind of platform, the kind of technology that workers can deal with in a flexible way. So it's difficult, for example, at work to take time to read a newsletter, but in many workplaces, it's perfectly acceptable. Your employer has no problem if you plug headphones into your phone and listen to something. They'll assume you're listening to music or an audiobook or something, but if instead you're listening to something from your union, I think that's a great thing. In the information that they impart aside, this is an organizing tool. My favorites currently, this changes sort of day to day, but my current favorites are Portugal's CGTP and the Professional Footballers of Australia. They have both have daily podcasts, or anywhere from a minute to 10 minutes long. Short, sharp, I presume informative. I don't speak Portuguese, but it sounds good. Every PowerPoint presentation has to have an inspirational slide. This is it. Okay. And this is also my way of to turn the clock back a bit, or turn the PowerPoint deck back a bit. This is also my way of, before we get too close to the end of my presentation, this is my way of reminding you that other folks are able to actually turn this around and start thinking about making gains as a result of the pandemic, rather than simply defending themselves, or their unions and their members against employers and governments and the pandemic itself. And in addition to questions, I would be very happy to hear from any of you who have any stories about, or tips or tricks about how your union has changed what it does in response to the pandemic. And here's the slide you've all been waiting for. Yes, it's actually over. I'm done. Thank you for your time and your patience. I'm going to leave this up just for a second while I have a sip of coffee, and then I'm going to hit the stop share button and turn control back over to somebody else, somebody whose name I've forgotten, with apologies.
You're going to turn control back to Leanne, Derek. So thank you very much for this presentation. We want to thank you for taking the time to put it together for us. And we hope to see you back. This was actually quite informative. And if you have time for some questions, we have about 15 minutes.
Absolutely.
So if somebody wants to put a question in chat.
We have one.
Okay.
Jim Streb, thanks for coming. So Derek, as always, this is reading for Jim now. You have presented a well-researched and informative presentation. I guess I could read for both of us on that one, actually. There were several points made today that should lead to some heady discussion within the CCU. So it was good to see you again. Thank you for his presentation today. So do you have any advice for the only all-Canadian Labour Central? What could or should the CCU do to help the hardest hit workers? Good question.
I'm not sure that I have the advice for the only all Canadian, but I think I have some advice for the sort of smaller than the CLC, and in my experience anyway, more nimble of the labor federation, central labor bodies in the country. And that is do something. The do it quick. And you haven't got the resources of, to be blunt, you haven't got the resources of the CLC, but you do have the ability to respond much more quickly than they do for a bunch of reasons, which, if this were a meat space meeting, I would suggest, we could talk about that over a beer, at the end of your day. But you haven't got the resources and you haven't got the time, perhaps more importantly, to experiment. You should be doing, I think, I'm probably projecting my interests onto you, but I think that it is worth your time to try and figure out what's being done elsewhere at a much grittier level of detail than the one I just provided in my little survey, and make some reasonable decisions about what you think would work and what you think might not work, and then apply those. And the other thing that I hope you're doing is that I hope you're sharing information amongst all of your affiliates about what's working and what's not working. There is on the, not to mention names, but that larger central labor body, if it has been collecting information about what's working and what's not working, it hasn't been sharing it, not at the level of a local union anyway, where most of these things would get applied. And there's no evidence that I can see, but again, I'm retired and so not an insider any longer, but I'm not seeing much evidence that information is being shared even at the level of national unions. And you will find, I'm trying to see who's here, but you will find that approaching one of the global union federations or even approaching the ITUC, they're pretty receptive. You may need a bit of a guide, somebody who can tell you who to talk to and what to expect and how to pose the question. But I think you'll find that they're quite receptive and quite willing to share the information they have. They'll probably check, if they don't know you, they'll check with the CLC to make sure that you're not a front for the Christian Labor Association of Canada, something along those lines. But once that's established, once your credentials are out there, then I think you'll find they're very helpful. Does that do it, Jim? And Jim, your hair's gone gray. Unlike mine. It's been a while, Jim. Good to see you. I see.
Derek, I'm wondering if you can just talk about your shirt that you're wearing.
Oh, yes. Sorry. LabourStart did this as a, I don't know if you can see that, as a fundraiser earlier this year. If anyone's interested, I think I've got 2 or 3 in the basement left of Canada's portion of them. And the first people to send me an email with their address will get one in the mail. I think I've got 3. So get typing. In my limited, I'm not a political sociologist, well, I'm not a political sociologist. My sense of many of those countries like Sweden, Norway, Australia, and Brazil is that it was once true of Canada as well. The labor movement was either spawned the political party, or was an equal partner with an existing sort of middle class intelligentsia that defined itself as socialist and created a political party. In some cases, like the PTI, is that what it is? In Brazil, the Workers' Party. In some cases, it's actually difficult to distinguish the union from the party. I think that's also true in up until the recent election in Peru, where the political part, where the union that acts as a political party during elections sort of created a coalition or joined a coalition, I'm not sure which, with a bunch of other political formations to win the election. In Canada, that was true for a long time. And I think, I'm trying to remember, I left the NDP in the early 1990s. And I think it was around about that time that no, it wasn't put this way, but the labor movement was kicked out of the NDP.
Yeah.
Well, you can, I'm not sure that you can say you can see the results, because I'm not sure that we have lost or gained tremendously either way out of that. But there certainly isn't the organic connection between the two that there used to be. And I'm not sure that I would, it is important, but to have those linkages and to have some influence. I think the difficulty is that when, and it's not I don't mean this to, sorry, I'm stumbling around here. I hate you, Sean. Next time, an easy question.
Okay.
How's the weather in Coburg would have been fine. I don't mean to discourage anyone from forging those links with a progressive political party, but the difficulty is that very often a union that does that finds itself in a subservient position. So we're not the experts on how to get a bill passed in some provincial legislature or even at city council. And so they have the expertise, that kind of technical expertise. And as technicians very often do, they tend to overcome the politics, or they come to dominate the politics. The technicians, the political operatives, the professional politicians tend to elbow us aside. And we find ourselves following and having maybe a little bit of influence, but having to make huge compromises in exchange for that small amount of influence. So pick your party carefully, and just, before every meeting that you have with them, have a little, big group hug, and remind yourselves that, you represent the working class, and they're just a bunch of political hacks. And you should be driving the agenda, not them.
I'm not sure. Is there any more questions?
Yeah,
Leanne?
Will has-
We probably have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to break.
I think there's one in the chat there.
from Will, yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like it seems more of a comment than a question to me.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what I was just looking at. Oh, but Derek, there was a question about your email and contact information. Are you able to copy and paste that and put that in the chat for everyone?
Let me just.
And while he does that, we'll take one more call for one final question.
If there's
Great.
any hands, I don't see any hands.
Well, thank you, Derek, so much. That was very informative. I think we've learned a ton. We really want to thank you for coming, and thank everyone for coming to this labor school. We really hope to see you at the next one. We have a quick poll we're going to launch. I can get it going. So if you have to take off, or if you're staying for EB, if you wouldn't mind answering this quick poll, that'd be awesome. Everyone is welcome to stay as a guest for the first half hour of our executive board meeting coming up in about 15 minutes. So for those of you planning to attend our board meeting, we're just going to take a 15-minute break. And otherwise, those of you who just came to attend Labor School today, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for engaging in the questions, and we hope to see you at the next one. And feel free to email us, contact us through our social media, however, and stay in touch.
Thank you guys for the invitation. Always fun to drop in on CSU. It's CCU. It's particularly fun to be able to do so wearing sweatpants and slippers. And have a great executive board meeting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Derek. Again, I'd like to thank you for preparing what you did for us. I'm hoping, I know you're going to get questions. I'm hoping that we can get your PowerPoint if that's possible, and then we can share it amongst our affiliates and our guests as well. And, we'll be getting in contact with you. We'll have a gift for yourself and a donation will be coming on behalf of the CCU. So once again, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, folks.
Thank you.